Thank you for the invitation to present. My name is Camaren Peter. I am an extraordinary senior lecturer with the School of Public Leadership at the University of Stellenbosch. Today, I'd like to speak to you about the challenge of sustainability, and urban sustainability in particular, in the cities of the Global South. And the basic argument I'll be making is that this is more than just a technological challenge. So let's begin. The traditional way of defining sustainability was first put forward by the Brundtland Commission, where it spoke to the need for social, economic, and environmental sustainability. However, in more recent work, people such as Professor Edgar Peterser, who is the director of the African Center for Cities, pointed out that in reality, sustainable development plans usually put priority on economic and environmental objectives, and social objectives are often sacrificed. He also identified that for cities of the Global South, that is, developing world cities which face rather intractable challenges, two additional key elements are required. Firstly, physical sustainability, which is the sustainability of physical infrastructures and the technologies that are deployed in cities. And he also draws attention to the need for political sustainability. Immediately when we look at the extension of this definition, it implies that we have to start thinking more deeply about how we deal with the challenges of urban sustainability in the developing world. These two additional requirements call for a somewhat different approach. So let's discuss some of the challenges that exist in the developing world. Firstly, developing world cities, especially cities in Africa, are characterized by slums and informality. And by informality, I mean informal land and housing settlement, as well as whole informal systems of trade, service provision, and employment. The upshot of the high levels of slums and informality, particularly in terms of human settlements, is that municipalities in places like Africa are largely unable to collect municipal finance. Municipal finance is usually derived through property rates and taxes, and where you have such high levels of informality, for example, between 60 and 80% levels of informality in cities in Africa. On average, it's 62%, but in some parts it's as high as 80%. You find that municipalities are financially broke. They are unable to collect the revenues they need to be able to deliver. On top of this, they have a lack of institutional capacity. They often don't have the skills and just the actual human capacity, meaning the numbers of people that are required to fulfill certain functions. Institutional capacity is also hampered by the large infrastructure deficit that exists, so that the delivery mechanisms for service delivery in particular are not realized in the majority of these cities. And as a result, private sector actors as well as informal sector actors have to move in to close the gap. So in terms of infrastructure and service deficits, we've seen a large number of service delivery protests, not just in Southern Africa and South Africa, where it's been particularly high. There are about 100 service delivery protests in South Africa per year, but we've seen them spread throughout Africa, from east, west, central, east, west, central, and Southern Africa. On top of this, we also have high levels of political instability in the developing world, sort of countries and cities. And often, politically speaking, there's a lack of vision in terms of how to tackle the challenges which often seem intractable to leadership. But there's also another factor which plays a large role, which is the aspirations that exist in cities where there are high levels of inequality between the tiny wealthy elites and the majority poor. And the aspirations are generally towards Western consumer-based lifestyles. And the reality of those aspirations is that should they be achieved, it would mean that cities, particularly in Africa, will become unsustainable, as they will be unable to maintain the high levels of consumption and waste that results from those aspirations. And lastly, given the large range of challenges I've just discussed, environment is often seen as a low priority. So the environment often suffers from encroachment of private developers, as well as encroachment from slums, and the use of the environment as a substitute where services aren't available. For example, water and wood for use as fuel. So when you look at all these challenges, it very clearly tells us that technological solutions alone are not going to bring up the sustainability that we're looking for. The contexts, especially in Africa, vary from location to location, such that there isn't a technological panacea that can be deployed in any context and bring about the kind of sustainability that we're looking to achieve. So what is required? Well, one of the key things we require are the mechanisms to overcome the institutional fragmentation. Yeah. So we need governance and planning that integrates across sectors, different institutions, that can think about how it integrates between different infrastructures, for example, how energy infrastructures and water infrastructures relate to each other. And there's been a prevalence of master planning approaches towards cities in Africa in particular. Usually colonial planning instruments are used for planning in the cities. And what I'm arguing for is planning that is more sensitive to local context. And lastly, what we need to build are resilience to external shocks. Households and businesses and even institutions in the developing world are highly sensitive to price changes, for example, in the price of oil. The price of oil affects the price of food. In poor countries, especially the developing world countries, where between 60 to 75% of household budgets can be spent on food and energy alone, that includes transport, the resilience to these external shocks is very important to start thinking about, especially in our future planning of these cities. If we put in place infrastructures now that do not take this resilience into account, essentially we lock ourselves into patterns of behavior, often unsustainable patterns of behavior, for the next 40 or 50 years. So it's important to be thinking about what we can do right now to make the difference that we want. So more on what we can do about it. We can deploy strategic intermediaries, especially in the developing world context, where there's a lot of innovation that still needs to be generated in terms of how we solve local problems. Innovations that can speak to the local contextual needs of people. So in terms of this, we can have innovation and enterprise hubs. Urban labs are also important as strategic intermediaries. By this, for example, I mean labs that serve monitoring and evaluation functions, such as the third bullet I've got below, which is the Gauteng City Region Observatory, is a good example. It's collecting all the information it can about land settlement changes, about migration, about material flows through the city of Johannesburg and the province of Gauteng, and it's going to make this available to decision makers so that they can make better decisions about urban development in the future. Funding agencies can also play a key role, as well as we need to think about how we conduct participatory governance in a way that truly empowers communities, that gives communities ownership over the developments that occur in their neighborhoods and communities, and not just having them as participants in one-off processes, which are essentially processes to legitimize projects and only engage people for a short period of time. Thematic projects are also very useful. Mass public transport projects, for example, create hundreds of thousands of jobs and have huge potential in African cities. and in particular, it can overcome some of the spatial inequalities that exist in terms of access and mobility in the city. Another example is the Sustainable Human Settlements Agenda in South Africa. The Ministry of Housing has changed its name to Ministry of Human Settlements because it's made the realization that building more houses is not going to solve the housing crisis in South Africa. In South Africa, we've got a housing backlog of 400,000 in the city of Johannesburg and 400,000 in the city of Cape Town. We're only building between 8,000 and a maximum of 15,000 a year. So it's going to take us 30 to 40 years to meet the backlog alone. And in the meantime, our cities are growing. We need to be thinking about integrated service delivery, and as the minister puts it, of human settlements in South Africa, he's thinking beyond the sustainability of these human settlements in terms of purely their resource efficiency alone. He's arguing that we need to build neighborhoods which can act as attractors for investment, that can be functional communities, and as he puts it, places where people can fall in love. So we need to think about how we deploy appropriate technologies. The latest high-tech solution is not always the best solution. Sometimes we can use low-tech solutions to great effect because they can be more easily serviced and maintained, and they don't require the kind of skills levels that are required to service your high technology, such as wind turbines and solar PV and thermal. We also need to rethink infrastructure development. If we're going to be putting in place large infrastructures in African cities, these large infrastructures are usually put together in public-private partnerships under a centralized operator. This is water and energy are all handled in the same way. Yet, if we start thinking about how we semi-decentralize and decentralize these infrastructures, we can create more opportunities for small to medium operators and more employment, which is desperately needed in these cities where we have a high youth bulge and high youth unemployment. We can start creating opportunities through how we put infrastructures in place. So decentralization and diversification is important, and we also need to think through the inclusion of people in developmental agendas, because ultimately urban political constituency in Africa in particular will soon dominate the political agenda. And this is a big shift from an Africa where previously the rural vote determined the politics of regions and the continent. And this is a big change. We have an opportunity through development to rebuild communities which are highly fragmented in most African cities, and to start building a political constituency which can bring the long-term sustainability that we need. And as a last note, we need to look at the role of secondary towns. Between large metropoles and even in transboundary regional corridors, there are a number of smaller to intermediate-sized cities springing up. In fact, most of the growth globally and in Africa is occurring in small cities, which are under the size of 100,000 or under the size of 500,000 people. And these secondary towns are very important to think through, because they will most likely be the best linkages to the rural hinterlands which have been left behind by the high rates of urbanization in Africa in particular. So thinking through the functional specialization of these towns, whether they act as mining towns, or whether they are tourism towns, or whether they are agricultural towns, or whether they are new towns that become established that act that provide services. This is also a very important aspect of urbanization to think through, because in reality this is where the majority of people will be living in Africa in the future. And I've included a few references at the end of the presentation for further reading for any interested listeners. Thank you very much.